It was one of those quiet weekends. The sun was out, the birds were chirping, and I was finally catching up on some peace and quiet. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down on my porch when I heard the sound of heels clicking sharply against the pavement. It was the kind of sound that broke the calm, quick, sharp, and full of purpose. I looked up and immediately felt my stomach drop. There she was, the HOA president. Now, if you've ever dealt with an HOA president who thinks they run the entire neighborhood like a mini-government, you already know how this story starts. But this wasn't just any HOA president. This woman had the attitude of a courtroom judge, a traffic cop, and a reality TV villain all rolled into one. Her name was Linda, but everyone in the neighborhood just called her the enforcer. And today she looked like she meant business. She marched straight toward my driveway like she owned it, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, lips pursed like she was walking into a courtroom. I hadn't done anything wrong, at least I didn't think I had. My grass was cut, trash bins pulled in, and my car was clean. I couldn't think of a single reason she'd need to talk to me. "Good morning," I said cautiously. She didn't even respond. Just looked at me over her glasses and said, "I need to get into your backyard." That was it. No hello. No explanation. Just a demand. I blinked. "I'm sorry?" She snapped her gum and repeated it, slower this time. "I need to get into your backyard." I stayed polite. Why?" "I don't have to explain," she said. "I'm the HOA president. I have authority. Now listen. I've dealt with some strange requests before. Someone once knocked on my door asking if my porch light was too emotionally aggressive at night. But this was a new level. "Sorry," I said with a slight shrug. "But I'm not letting anyone into my backyard without a reason." That did it. Her eyes widened and her jaw tensed. "Do you understand what you're doing right now?" she asked, voice rising. I kept my tone calm. "I do. I'm saying no. It's my property." She took a deep breath and looked like she was trying very hard not to explode. Her face turned a shade of red that made me think of ketchup left out in the sun. "This is a violation," she snapped. "You're in breach of Neighborhood Code 14B. Now, I may not be a legal expert, but I know enough to question it when someone randomly starts quoting imaginary codes." I just stood there trying not to laugh. "What's Code 14B?" I asked. She flipped through her clipboard aggressively, clearly buying time. "It's the rule about property inspections. I don't have to tell you the exact wording." Right then, I knew she was bluffing. But she wasn't going to back down. She huffed, muttered something under her breath, and finally said, "Fine. Have it your way. But you'll regret this." And just like that, she spun around on her heel and stormed off down the street. I watched her go, sipping my coffee, still trying to figure out what just happened. It was like being in a weird dream. What could she possibly want in my backyard? I knew I hadn't done anything to attract this kind of attention. There were no unauthorized garden gnomes, no loud music, no weird smells. Nothing. Still, I had this weird feeling in my gut. Something told me that wasn't the end of it. And I was right. Not even 15 minutes later, I heard sirens. At first, I thought it was just someone getting pulled over nearby. It happens. But then I saw the flashing lights turning into my street. 2 police cars pulled up slowly and stopped in front of my house. My heart skipped a beat. Not because I was scared, I hadn't done anything wrong, but because it was so absurd, so unexpected, I didn't know how to react. I stood up and walked toward the driveway, coffee still in hand. One officer stepped out of the car with a relaxed but slightly amused expression. "Morning," he said. "We got a call about a disturbance here?" I raised my eyebrows. "A disturbance?" Behind the officer, Linda came marching back into view like she'd just summoned the entire justice system. She pointed at me like she was directing traffic. "That's him," she shouted. "He's being aggressive and refusing to comply with HOA inspection policies." The officer turned to her and asked calmly, "Ma'am, did you say he was aggressive?" She nodded dramatically. "Yes. He wouldn't let me into the backyard. That's suspicious behavior." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I opened my mouth to respond, but the officer beat me to it. "What exactly was the emergency here?" he asked, voice still patient. Linda threw her hands up. "He's hiding something. There's a plant. A plant that's not on the approved HOA list." There was a pause. A long, awkward pause. The officer blinked. "You called 911 for a plant?" She stood tall, clearly thinking this was the moment she'd be praised for her service to the community. "Yes," she said. "I believe he may be growing something illegal. Or unapproved. At the very least, it's not on the HOA landscaping standards list." At that point, The second officer had joined the conversation and was clearly struggling to keep a straight face. He looked at me, then at her, then back at me. I just shrugged. You understand, the first officer said to Linda, that 911 is for emergencies, right? Life-threatening situations. She didn't miss a beat. This is an emergency. If everyone starts planting whatever they want, where does it end? The second officer let out a short laugh before quickly covering it with a cough. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. I mean, I'd heard of petty power trips before, but this was next level. The first officer turned back to me. Sir, do you mind telling us what's in your backyard? Some tomato plants, I said simply. And a rose bush my mom gave me. He nodded slowly, lips twitching with a smile. And those are threatening the community? Linda crossed her arms. They weren't approved. The second officer finally lost it. He started laughing, not loudly but enough that he had to walk away for a second to compose himself. I looked at Linda, who was fuming now. Her face had gone from red to purple. She pointed again. This is what I'm talking about. You're all enabling him. The first officer sighed. Ma'am, unless there's a real emergency, we're going to have to ask you to stop calling 911 for this sort of thing. But I'm the president, she shouted. Of the HOA, the officer reminded her calmly. Not the country. And with that, the entire mood shifted. Linda had lost control of the situation, and it was clear. The more she talked, the more ridiculous she sounded. The officers stayed professional, but you could tell they'd had enough. Still, I stayed quiet. No need to add fuel to the fire. I just stood there watching her unravel. And deep down, I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. The officers were trying their best to keep things professional, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. One of them scratched the back of his head and looked toward my house, then back at Linda, like he was double-checking whether this was some kind of prank. Linda stood there with her arms crossed, her expression hard and victorious, as if she'd just brought down a crime ring. She clearly thought she'd done the neighborhood a huge favor, like she had single-handedly protected everyone from some deep threat hidden in my backyard. All over a couple of plants. The first officer, a tall guy with a calm voice and a kind face, stepped toward me. Sir, I just want to confirm one more time, you haven't made any threats and there's nothing illegal in your backyard? I smiled, trying to hide how ridiculous I felt even answering that. No threats, officer. Just tomatoes and roses. He nodded, jotting something down on a small notepad, probably more out of formality than anything else. Do you mind if we take a quick look just to wrap this up? Not at all, I said, turning toward my backyard gate. The officers followed me while Linda tried to squeeze herself between them. The second officer, a younger guy who still had that barely contained grin on his face, gently stopped her. Ma'am, we've got it from here. But I have the right to see it too, she insisted. No, ma'am. You don't, he said firmly. She stomped her foot like a child being told no candy before dinner. This is outrageous. We walked into the backyard and the officers looked around. Tomato plants lined the fence, each one supported by little metal cages. In the corner was the rose bush, a little overgrown, sure, but beautiful. There were also some herbs in small pots and a bird feeder swinging in the breeze. The first officer chuckled. This is what she was upset about? I guess so, I said, folding my arms. He crouched to get a better look at the rose bush and then stood up. Looks good to me. Nothing illegal, nothing threatening. The second officer was already walking back toward the gate. Let's go let her know. I followed them, unsure how Linda would react. I could already hear her muttering to herself before we even rounded the corner. As soon as we stepped back out, she pounced. Well, did you see it? Did you find it? The first officer looked exhausted. Yes, ma'am. We saw the backyard. And? It's fine. There's nothing illegal. Nothing dangerous. Just plants. Linda's jaw tightened. But they're unapproved. I told you, those types of rose bushes aren't on the official landscaping list. The second officer raised his eyebrows. Do you have a law that bans rose bushes? She blinked. No, but we have a policy. A policy isn't the same thing as a law, ma'am. And you can't enforce private property rules using emergency services. She looked like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. The officer wasn't done. 911 is for real emergencies. People get hurt. There are break-ins. Accidents. You called us for a plant inspection. That's not just unnecessary, it's abuse of the system. I was trying to do my job, she shouted. If we don't enforce the rules, the neighborhood falls apart. His voice didn't rise. It stayed calm but with an edge. If everyone called 911 every time someone had a non-standard plant, we wouldn't be able to respond to people who really need help. She stood there, red-faced, speechless for once. And then, out of nowhere, she started crying. I wasn't expecting it. Neither were the officers. One second she was yelling. The next she had tears streaming down her face, her mascara starting to smudge. I try so hard, she sobbed. No one respects me. No one listens. Everyone thinks I'm just some control freak. The younger officer gave me a quick look, unsure how to react. It was awkward. Painfully awkward. The older officer stepped forward, a bit softer now. Look, we understand that it's stressful. But this isn't the way to handle it. She sniffled, wiping her nose on her sleeve. I just wanted the neighborhood to be perfect. There was a pause. And for a second, just a second, I almost felt bad for her. Maybe she really did start with good intentions. Maybe she got caught up in the power. Or maybe she just didn't know how to let go of things that didn't really matter. But sympathy or not, the facts were still the facts. She called the police over a backyard tomato plant. She had turned a non-issue into a scene, embarrassed herself, and wasted police time. The second officer shifted his weight. Ma'am, we're going to file this as a misuse of emergency services. No charges today, but it will go on record. If it happens again, there could be fines or worse. That seemed to snap her back to reality. Her face fell even more. But I didn't mean. He shook his head. Intentions don't always justify actions. Just think about it, all right? The officers turned to leave and I walked with them toward the sidewalk. Neighbors had started to peek out their windows. A couple were even standing at their driveways watching quietly. Word was already spreading. The first officer glanced at me. Sorry you had to deal with that. I smiled. Honestly, I'm used to her. But this was a new one. He laughed. Tomato plants, man. Who knew? The younger officer pulled open the car door but paused. You know, I've dealt with all kinds of calls. Burglars. Missing pets. Noise complaints. But this, he grinned. This is going to be one for the books. I thanked them both again as they got into their cars and pulled away. The street fell quiet once more. Linda was still standing there, wiping her face, avoiding eye contact. The moment had clearly drained her. I didn't say anything to her. I just turned and went back inside. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the porch light came on, I sat back down with a fresh cup of coffee. It was peaceful again. Quiet. But this time there was a strange new energy in the air. Something had shifted. And though I didn't know it then, that ridiculous day, the one with cops, crying, and tomato plants, would end up changing more than just my Saturday plans. The neighborhood didn't stay quiet for long. By the next morning, everyone knew what had happened. I didn't have to say a word. The story spread like wildfire. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in weeks suddenly waved as they walked by. One guy, Jeff from 2 houses down, even knocked on my door just to say, "Heard you survived the Great Tomato Inspection." Legendary. Then he laughed and handed me a muffin. I didn't ask why he had a muffin ready. I just took it and laughed along. But the real surprise came later that afternoon. I was in the front yard trimming a few branches when I saw a group of people gathering near the community board. That board had always been ignored, buried in old flyers and faded announcements. But today, people were reading it like it held the final results of a local election. So I wandered over. Turns out, someone had submitted a formal petition to call a special HOA meeting. The reason? Review of HOA leadership behavior and actions. No names were listed, but it didn't need to be spelled out. Everyone knew who it was about. Linda. Some of the neighbors were trying to keep their tone polite, but you could feel it in the air. Frustration that had been simmering for months was finally boiling over. People shared stories in low voices. How she threatened one family with fines for leaving a kiddie pool out. How she left angry notes on someone's mailbox because their Halloween decorations stayed up one day too long. How she knocked on a door at 6:30 in the morning just to ask someone to repaint their mailbox post. Nobody had ever really stood up to her before, not publicly. She was loud. She was relentless. And honestly, most of us just didn't want the hassle. But something about seeing the police show up over a garden pushed people past their limit. It was too far even for her. As I walked back to my house, I saw Linda's car pulling into her driveway. She moved slower than usual, head down, eyes avoiding the street. No sunglasses. No clipboard. No power walk. It was like watching a balloon with all the air slowly leaking out. A few days later, the HOA meeting was announced. It would be held in the clubhouse next to the community pool, a small beige building that normally sat empty unless someone booked it for a birthday party. But that night it was packed. I showed up early expecting the usual 5 or 6 people. Instead, there were at least 30 residents squeezed into plastic chairs. Some stood in the back. People brought printouts, photos, even notes on their phones. And then, finally, Linda walked in. She tried to act like she still had control, straightening her back and clearing her throat before she spoke. "Let's keep this orderly," she said. "I know there are some concerns." But the first hand shot up before she could finish. It was Mr. Brown, a retired Navy officer known for being calm and collected. "No disrespect," he said firmly, "but I think it's time someone else took a turn. Your actions last weekend were beyond unacceptable." A few people murmured in agreement. Linda tried to cut in. "If I could just explain." But then Mrs. Hargrove, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, raised her voice. "You called the police on a homeowner for growing flowers. Flowers, Linda. And then you cried in the street like the victim." Linda looked stunned. Another neighbor added, "You humiliated yourself. But worse, you made us all look like fools. What if the police had been needed somewhere else? What if there had been a real emergency?" She tried to defend herself, talking about rules, about order, about the principles of a good neighborhood. But nobody was buying it. The more she spoke, the more people shared their own experiences. One woman mentioned how Linda had threatened to report her for letting her teenage son park in the driveway. A man spoke about how she once took photos of his trash bins to prove they were out too early. The list went on. The room wasn't angry. It was tired. Tired of walking on eggshells. Tired of power trips. Tired of the tension that had wrapped around every small issue in the neighborhood. And now they were ready for change. Eventually, someone made the motion, officially. "I'd like to vote to remove Linda as HOA president, effective immediately." There was a pause. Linda looked around, waiting for someone to speak up in her defense. No one did. The vote passed, overwhelmingly. She didn't storm out. She didn't yell. She just stood still as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. She slowly gathered her things and left the room. For the first time in years, she was quiet. After the meeting ended, people lingered, laughing, chatting. Some even brought snacks, like it had become an impromptu block party. There was a different energy now, lighter. Like a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Over the next week, the change became visible. Kids played in front yards without their parents constantly peeking out to make sure they weren't too loud. A neighbor put up wind chimes without fear of getting a typed complaint letter. Someone added a bird bath to their front lawn, even though Linda had once claimed they attracted the wrong type of birds. It was peaceful, natural, the kind of neighborhood it was supposed to be. I kept to myself mostly. I didn't want credit. I wasn't trying to be a hero. But one evening while walking my dog, I passed by the old community board again. Someone had tacked up a note. It wasn't an announcement. Just a scrap of paper with a message scribbled in pen. "Thank you for saying no." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't signed. Didn't need to be. Life moved on as it always does. The tomatoes grew bigger. The rose bush bloomed again. New people joined the HOA board, people who smiled when you saw them on the street. People who asked questions instead of giving orders. As for Linda, I saw her once more a few weeks later, leaving her house with a suitcase. Maybe visiting family. Maybe just needing a break. We didn't speak. But as she got into her car, she looked over and gave me a small nod. I returned it. Nothing more needed to be said. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one simple no, to change everything. Not just for you, but for everyone quietly wishing someone else would do it first.